Welcome to InFocus. This is Pastor Mike from La Center Church. This week in our discussion, we want to look at the idea of cultivation and what we see in the scripture that God uses the principle of cultivation to prepare the soil for the good news of the gospel. And we see that, that principle or that pattern throughout scripture. And we see that process of cultivating the soil, preparing it for the seed. The seed is planted, the seed is watered, it begins to sprout, it begins to grow, and then there's a reaping of the harvest. And so this is kind of a principle we find out in the scripture. And we see that it's really God's plan to prepare people for the good news of Christ. And so how did he go about doing that? Well, first of all, we see in the scripture that there was several dispersions of the Jews. So they were scattered throughout the nations in various times. And one of the earlier times was when the 10 tribes, the northern 10 tribes, were taken over by Assyria, and then they were taken captive and they were scattered throughout the area of Assyria at that time. Then, of course, we had a little bit later, Babylon comes down and conquers Judea and takes people captive back to Babylon, and they're rehomed basically in Babylon area, and they stay there for 70 years before many of them come back. But there were still some that stayed in those foreign countries. And then we find the same thing happened during the Greek expansion, during the Grecian wars, and how that they came down into the Palestinian area, and again the Jewish people scattered and took their faith with them at that time. And we see it also in the early Christian church, because we had the church began in Jerusalem, and it was growing and it was multiplying and it was being really powerful, and then all of a sudden we have the persecution breaking out. And Stephen is stoned, he is killed, and after Stephen was stoned, a great persecution broke out against the church, and they scattered again throughout the area of Judea and Samaria, and even farther, as we have seen so far in the scripture. They've gone even as far as Damascus and up to even Antioch. And so we have Christians that were moving, and in the process they were taking their faith with them. That's God's process of preparing the soil for the good news of the gospel. And in the part of Stephen's death and the persecution that followed, a key person that was a part of that dispersion that happened at that time was Lazarus. If you remember the story of Jesus raising him from the dead. And of course the Jewish leaders wanted to put him back to death because he was such a powerful witness. And so after that persecution broke out, he too left, and he went up to the area of Cyprus. Well, we look back and we see also Barnabas was from Cyprus. He was a Jewish immigrant, or his family was, to Cyprus, and he was back in Jerusalem, but his family stayed in Cyprus. So we have a lot of that cultivation. And what was important in that process is when they left their home in Jerusalem or their Jewish heritage, they took their faith with them on what they understood. And so the Jewish people would take and set up synagogues in the area, and they would continue to practice their faith amongst the Gentiles. And so they were intermixing, and they were being a light to the Gentiles that were out there. And so that was kind of God's pattern of preparing the soil for the gospel. And so now we have the gospel expanding into the Gentile territories, and one of the things that we see in that is the early missionaries, Paul and Barnabas and others as well, would go to the Jewish synagogue first and share the good news of Christ. And they would talk to the Jewish people there, those that were worshiping there, about how Jesus had fulfilled the Old Testament law, and how he was that sacrifice for our sin, and how he was the Son of God, and how he provides atonement. And so they had that foundation for their faith because of their Jewish heritage, and then Jesus would be explained, and that was a fertile soil, a cultivated soil that could receive the seed. then it would expand out beyond that to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles that were close friends of the Jewish people that were coming to Christ then would say, I want to know more about that. And they were coming to Christ as well. So we have that cultivation process going on. And that has been something that was historical throughout the Old Testament. I mean, you go back to Joseph going down to Egypt. I mean, he was taken as a slave, but yet he became an advisor to Pharaoh at that time. And he had an influence in Egypt. And you have Daniel being taken from Judea to Babylon, and he had an influence, and he became an advisor to the king, to various kings over a period of time. And he had an influence, and his influence permeated that area. And you have Esther and Mordecai, and they had an influence. And all of those folks were cultivating the soil of faith in a Gentile area. Well, what we're going to see this week as Paul and Barnabas go on to Cyprus, they go first to synagogues to share the good news. And one of the interesting things, a couple interesting things in that, is Barnabas's brother comes to Christ at some point. It's not referenced in the scripture per se, but he becomes a bishop or a pastor in one of the early churches there in Cyprus, as well as Lazarus. So we have Lazarus had been resurrected by Christ. He takes his faith with him as he goes up to Cyprus, and he becomes a pastor or a bishop in one of those communities. And so we have that cultivating process going on, in the scripture that we're looking at this morning as Paul and Barnabas go and they begin to share Christ in that whole island of Cyprus. Well, how we can learn from that is God places each of us in a location where he wants us to be that process of cultivating the soil. So we are located next to neighbors. We work in places where there are non-Christians. We have relationships with people in our community. All of that is that process of cultivating, just by our presence and our living our life before others, prepares the soil for the gospel. And then the second step is, of course, planting the seed. And that's where you and I have the opportunity to share. This is what Christ means to me, and answer questions and to give a reason for the hope that we have within us. And that is God's design that we see working out in the book of Acts as we continue our study on the church that is on mission from the book of Acts. I hope to see you this Sunday as we continue on and we look at Paul and Barnabas' trip to Cyprus and their witness there. This is Pastor Mike from La Center Church. Thanks for watching.